Welcome to the OFX podcast. This is Bethany McChesney. Dave Claxon is absent today. He is flying back from a DECA race weekend. But we have a guest today who we're excited to have back on, Corinna Perkins. So we'll have a great chat without Dave, but he will be missed. So we had Corinna on a couple weeks ago. She's a registered dietitian focusing primarily with working with athletes. And we had so many questions that we didn't get through it all last time. And this one, we wanted to focus a little bit more on the myths and the facts surrounding nutrition because there are so many misconceptions and really bad information out there. And I get all of the questions all the time too. And I'm constantly learning also. So to have an expert come on too and just really get into the nitty gritty of some of this stuff, I think I'm excited to have you and have this conversation. So
Thank you. I'm excited to be back on. So thanks for round two.
mhm. And congratulations on the pregnancy.
Thank you. Yeah, little bit has changed since we chatted last. And yeah, some big life changes coming down the way.
Yeah. So how far along are you?
I'm almost 20 weeks, so we are halfway, which is kind of crazy. I feel like the first portion's been great though, so no complaints. I'm very blessed.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Do you have you changed much in your training? I noticed like you post still a lot of your training stuff and I
Um,
love seeing pregnant women work out, and I started my personal training stuff with pre and postnatal fitness. And I've always felt comfortable working with pregnant women. I always have pregnant women and post like very recently postpartum women. And I still have clients that come through my gym and they're pregnant for the first time and they have so much bad information coming at them too, and people just telling them they need to stop. And again, just so much fear around exercise and pregnancy because of a lack of information. And there was a period of time where it was very much thought that women shouldn't do anything when they're pregnant. So I think it's so important to continue to see women exercising when they're pregnant. Are you changing much in your training?
Yeah, I mean it's 9 months of a gradual growing process, right? And so it makes sense that, early on, and again, everyone responds differently with their first trimester and second trimester and how they're feeling, energy levels, whether they're sick all the time or not. And so I think that but taking like that aside, it's like as your body starts to change, as you start to feel more things, you really have to be aware of how you're feeling, how you're responding to different stimulus, especially in the gym, being open and willing to make adjustments and modifications as needed, but really trusting, as you mentioned, like trusting your body to tell you or to determine like when things might need to be changed up or adjusted or not. So I actually started adjusting my training. So really my last event of the year in 2024 was HyperCon Games back in, I think it was like mid-October. And so I was really trying to, my husband and I were really focused on really wanting to start our family. And so I automatically, like from since the end of that competition, like really started to pull back some high intensity training just because, it's that time of year, you're entering into the winter, like I'm exhausted. And there's no need to like be grinding into the ground, especially with my goals being shifted to be more, on the family building side of things. Does that mean that that was necessary and like I couldn't have gotten pregnant otherwise? I'm not saying that, and I don't know the answer to that, but to me, being gentle on my body, taking some time to reduce like really high intensity activity, focus on strength training, a little bit more. I mean, I look back and I'm like, I'm glad I did that. But that I ended up being a perfect segue once I found out that I was pregnant. I was like, oh, great. So I'll like kind of continue focusing on strength training, getting my heart rate up a bit with some little aerobic finishers, like maybe 10, 20 minutes max at the end of my lift sessions, but that seemed to work out really well for me. And then, I'll throw in a ruck. I'll still like ruck once a week, do some sprinting, and obviously it looks different depending on my energy levels. And now that I'm getting bigger, it's like, you get winded more, but I'm just glad that it was just kind of this, hey, I made this mental decision entering into this phase of life, and then really saw that through the first trimester and now into the second trimester with things. And I've been really happy with how I've been able to keep showing up for myself. Like I haven't had to do a ton of modifications. Toast to bar are
Yeah.
definitely like some of the core stuff. I'm starting to definitely just feel weaker, like pull-ups, lots of banded pull-ups. But I was really focusing on like lighter weight, tempo, slowing the eccentric, just working on time under tension. And then I didn't have like the comparison of, oh, but my max, my max back squat is this, and I'm only lifting this. Like, I don't think I would be that way, but it kind of took out all of the comparison or like ego in my lifting by really slowing down the rep schemes. So
Yeah.
I know that was
Yeah,
not,
and I do find again, because I've had so many clients come through the gym that are pregnant, is everyone is really different. I've had clients that have changed nothing and they're still doing like 30-inch box jumps like a week overdue. And like that to me, that blows my mind because I did have to change a fair bit, just
mm,
especially with my first pregnancy. I had a lot of pain with the uterine ligament and always had to wear a band. And I swam a lot more than I could do much impact. And my
mm,
second pregnancy was totally fine, but I was pregnant fairly long time ago, I suppose, from like 14 years ago with my first, but I had a trainer come up to me once in a gym and stop me. I was just doing dumbbell thrusters. I was 9 months pregnant, but like super light, and he was like, "You should not be doing that." And then he was like, "If you need any help with something, you come see me." It was like this older gentleman. And I'm like, I'm fine, thanks. And
yeah.
once I was like 4 months pregnant, and this was when I lived overseas in Dubai, and I had a woman run out onto the track and grab me, and
Oh
she
my gosh.
and she was like, "You have to stop, or you're gonna hurt your baby." Yeah,
Wow.
and I was like,
It's
I'm fine.
interesting.
Like I've been doing this my whole life. Like I'm fine, and I was barely pregnant. Like you could, so yeah, it was. I feel like things are changing, but I still have clients that come in and they're like, my aunt or my mother-in-law is telling me I need to stop, and like,
It
man,
it does seem to be a bit generational for sure.
yeah,
But I feel like we have enough research and studies now, and certainly anecdotal, like anecdotal uh information too, that like, women who do a lot of strength training or like are very active have much easier and shorter labor times. Like that's got to be such a, like that has to be well
yeah.
researched or well established by now. So yeah, it's
And the effects on the baby, like after the fact.
yeah,
So, which is really cool research too. So,
yeah.
anyways, you look great, still crushing it in the gym. So I love to see it.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been fun. And yeah, like I said, it's just it's a fun time to just, to acknowledge that you're doing something you've never done before. And it's the most incredible thing to be transforming and to be growing, another. So it's like all of this is just taking like whatever I have to show up for myself each morning is like what I've got, and I'm just going through the motions. If I have to slow things down, I can. If something hurts, I'm going to address that and not continue doing that. But it's really just more out of like curiosity and excitement as opposed to like trying to be the same person I was and do the exact same things and have this like not impact my life as much as possible. Like that's definitely not the approach I'm taking. It's like I'm embracing it all. And fortunately, it's been really, it's just been a really wonderful process so far.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have so many questions here. So I'm not sure if you want to start somewhere, or actually maybe we'll segue kind of from that into nutrition around exercise because with pregnancy, you do find you have to think about it even more. Um, just making sure that you're getting enough before and after. But There's a lot of questions within the nutrient timing before and after, and then also with special populations of people also where it does become, and I think we did touch on this last time with the perimenopausal women and the protein intake being needing to be closer after workouts, but um, nutrient timing before and after workouts and men and women differences because there is that uh,
Yeah.
also.
Yeah, and I forget if I mentioned this last time, but we have that period of nutrition hierarchy where, at the base of the pyramid is total energy intake, and then up from there it's macronutrients, and then the next level up is micronutrients, and towards the top of the pyramid we have nutrient timing and then supplements. And so I do think a lot of people, especially in my work with clients, a lot of people instantly go to the nutrient timing. And I think as timing relates to total intake throughout the day, like sure, then it becomes more of a priority. But I think it's very easy to get caught up in the nuances of like of especially pre and post workout nutrition timing. And if that's not like in the bigger picture, if we're not meeting our needs throughout the course of the total day, we're going to experience much greater performance decrements than if we were to focus on energy intake and then put nutrient timing a little bit further down the list. So all that to be said is like, especially when it comes to all of the macronutrients, but I think a lot of people think with timing protein and carbohydrates, the most important thing is making sure that you're getting adequate intake throughout the course of the entire day. Hitting your total protein goal is going to be the most important by far when it comes to the research around protein. And then secondary to that, but quite a bit lower as far as on a scale of significance, is the how it's distributed throughout the day. So make sure we get that total amount in first. And then if we can get that more evenly distributed across the day, great. Because the more, if you think about like, you know, um, peaks and troughs, just think about like a graph of the squiggly line that's going high and low and high and low. The peaks are representing our bouts of dietary protein intake. And that's when muscle protein synthesis or muscle growth has been maximized. And then when we're in the bottom, in the valleys or the troughs, that's when we are in a catabolic state. That's when maybe it's been several hours since our last meal and or we're doing a workout. Now our body's pulling amino acids for other processes throughout the body. So we don't store protein. And so we're either in a net positive balance and synthesizing proteins, or we're in a negative balance and our body's pulling it from like lean muscle tissue. So when we think about that, we ideally want to have the more peaks throughout our day, the better. So aiming for like 4 to 5 bouts of dietary protein intake. That's, it's going to depend on the size of the individual, the amount of lean muscle mass, but on average, at least 25 grams of protein, for larger individuals with greater lean muscle mass, that might look closer to 40. And you can absolutely go above that amount. It's just you're not necessarily getting additional benefits from muscle protein synthesis standpoint. Your body's going to use that protein intake. It's just not going to be that additional gain in lean muscle mass.
So this one, I'm not, again, this is one of my, is this a myth or is this true?
Mhm.
Take consuming fats immediately post exercise slows the uptake of protein into the muscle.
So anytime we're dealing with dietary fat, there is a slower digestion process, right? If you have even protein's going to slow down digestion compared to, a very simple carb. But when it comes to that post-workout period, I think we know that there's quite a large window post-workout where we can take in food, especially protein and carbohydrates. Really, that window becomes much smaller and important when you have a second competition or a second workout in close proximity to it. So when we're thinking about fat intake after a workout, really that's not going to impact unless it's an incredibly high amount of fat, like which most athletes in general, most active individuals, when it comes to their total macronutrient distribution throughout the day, we're going to want to have the majority of our calories are probably going to come from carbohydrates, right? Anywhere from like 40 to 50, maybe 55% of total calories, depending on the individual. Protein might be anywhere from the 20 to 30%, 30 on the higher end. And then whatever's left is kind of for fat, which might end up being like, ideally we're at least around 20% of total calories, but it's probably not going to exceed or probably shouldn't exceed 30 to 35% of total calories for most active individuals who are trying to focus on improving their performance. So in that sense, like there's never really a meal or a snack in a day with that breakdown to have a super high amount of fat in one sitting. Like you probably want to sprinkle it across the day. So that being said, I don't think that's anything to worry about. 10, 20 grams of fat post workout, it's really not going to slow it's
Your
really
recovery.
slow the recovery process very much, and definitely not significantly, because you think about it again, like you don't have just an hour or even 2 hours post workout that you need to maximize to get the most out of your performance, or recovery. It's like, again, that is, if you were going to jump in and do another workout 4 hours later, yeah, you probably want to prioritize just getting enough carbs and some protein in before that next bout. So fat doesn't really have as much of a purpose other than, increasing satiety in that meal afterwards. So I would say that's probably more of a myth or a misconception there. And
Mm.
uh, but at the same time, it's like we just want to make sure that, when we think about what we're utilizing and what's happening to our body, like during workouts, carbs and protein are definitely more of the priorities. And so they should get more of the priority post workout, um, rather than fat.
Yeah, that's good. Because I do find that's one too where yeah, people are like, I can't put avocado in my smoothie after a workout or whatever. So we can kind of let that one die too.
Yeah.
So then here's another one about timing and maybe more about weight loss or people wanting to lean out where they won't eat carbs after a certain point in the day. So carbs earlier in the day if you're trying to lose weight.
So So this is interesting because I do think that, when it comes to carbohydrate intake, definitely prioritizing carbs in and around your workout is important, especially for individuals who are maybe trying to achieve body comp goals or, straddle that line between performance, but also maybe aesthetics, or maybe performance isn't that much of a priority. Like hopefully, everyone wants to get better in the gym and show up each day and pushing themselves to move the needle forward. But at the same time, like I get it that there's a lot of individuals, a lot of my clients come to me and they're like, they want to focus on performance, they want to fuel well, but they also have some weight or body composition goals that they want to address as well.
Mm.
And so a great way to focus on that throughout the day is to prioritize carbohydrates before workout, after workout, just to make sure you're replenishing that. But then maybe in the middle of the day, especially if you're working a sedentary job, you're not really relying on a lot of carbohydrates, specific fuel throughout the day. That can be a great opportunity to pull back a little bit on carbohydrates, or just to or just to build out a smaller portion of overall calories if you're looking to create some sort of deficit. We definitely want to create deficits furthest away from our workouts as possible, so it's not impacting performance. But then if you think about towards the end of the day, I'm thinking about like our early morning or just morning workout goers. Like if you restrict carbohydrates later in the day, dinner time is going to be that last meal leading into your next morning's workout, especially if you don't have a full-blown breakfast beforehand. So you're kind of kicking yourself in the foot a little bit with in that scenario, because now, like, yeah, you did a good job of having a pre-workout, carbohydrate rich snack. But the night before you go into this whole, like this long overnight fast, you're not really providing yourself with much in the way of carbohydrates. So I always recommend like identify the meal in your day or the portion of your day that's furthest away from your workout. And I would count, again, for morning workouts, I would say that, um, I would say that we definitely want to make sure that breakfast is high in carbohydrates. And then lunch is probably the furthest away, whereas dinner is leading into the next day's training. So I would prioritize carbs a little bit more around, and you don't even have to do this, of course. Like you could just have fairly normal carbohydrate meals all throughout the day and be just fine. You definitely don't need to cycle it throughout the day like this. But for individuals who, might be looking for an extra edge from a composition or deficit, creating a deficit, like this could be a helpful strategy. But kind of bookending the day with more carbohydrates, maybe the middle of the day, if they're quite sedentary, they can kind of reduce that a little bit. Um, but your question was also around just like carbohydrates, before bed, or just like, were you just saying like just later in the day in general?
Yeah, I mean, typically what people do first, I find, is they cut out their carbs at night.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that, with nighttime carbohydrate intake, it's interesting because we know that, we know that we have a different glycemic response to carbohydrates and blood sugar response to carbohydrates later in the day compared to earlier in the day. And so, cutting off, I wouldn't go to the extent of saying like, oh, we should cut out carbohydrates, at dinner time, but certainly like late night snacking, especially on carbohydrate rich foods, is probably not a bad idea. Especially if you're able to get a good amount of carbohydrates earlier in the day, right? It's kind of like
Mhm.
with front loading calories and therefore carbohydrates. Like if your carbohydrate intake is really heavy at the end of the day, chances are you were probably restricting carbs earlier in the day. And now it's just like catching up to you and you're like, oh crap, like I'm craving carbs or I'm super hungry and you're diving into your snack pile, which is probably going to be a lot of carbohydrates. And so you're better off, managing that and planning that out a little bit more strategically earlier in the day.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm definitely more of an advocate of that, but again, it depends on the individual. If you're training later in the evening or in the afternoon, that's going to be a tricky situation to do that. And I wouldn't advise it because you need to have the fuel on board going into your workout and then, some afterwards, especially if you're going to an overnight fast. And I don't know if you see this with some of your athletes, Bethany, but like when we talk about sleep disruption, I think a lot of people worry about eating too much before bed because then it'll impact their sleep. But I have a lot of clients who wake up in the middle of the night frequently because they're hungry or they don't know they're like, they're not putting it together like, oh, I woke up because I'm hungry. But when our blood sugar drops to a certain level and we don't have the stored glycogen in our liver from eating enough carbohydrates to support those or maintain those blood sugar levels, yeah, we're going to wake up and our body's going to be like, hey, we need some food. So I think that's the flip side of it that we have to be really cautious about and be aware of, that like we also don't want to be too low on carbohydrates before bed. It's a long, hopefully it's a long night of sleep or it's a long night,
Yeah.
fasting. And we want to be prepared for that. We want to go in with enough on board.
Well, and it's interesting again, I'm working with some of my clients who are more in that perimenopausal age range, and if they're having frequent wake ups, it is something then that I'll recommend to them is like eat a meal before you go to bed and see if you sleep better. Like is it a glycemic response that's waking you up in the night, that 2, 3 o'clock? Are your stress levels really high? And then just kind of moving their food intake around a little bit and seeing if maybe that is it. And for some of them, they have been typically restricting before bed. So going to bed feeling full is initially kind of uncomfortable for them, but some of them have been finding that it's been helping their sleep quality too. So it is something to play around with. And I think one of the most important things is you do kind of allude to it too, is just being really intuitive also to what your body needs, and sometimes sticking to hard and fast rules about when things should and shouldn't based on something that you've heard somewhere about when you should and shouldn't eat carbs. Like it might not be where you're at. And we do change a lot, and especially with women with hormonal shifts and everything else too. And being able to stabilize our blood sugars is different with age also. So just be intuitive and kind of see what's happening as you try to shift things in your diet because it might not be the right thing for you.
Exactly. And there's a lot of really great research lately on taking protein consumption before bed and how that really helps like there's no blood sugar spike with protein intake and how that can be a really great way to also, a great opportunity to get a last bout of protein intake for the day if someone's low. It's like, oh, I'm low on protein, but it's almost time for bed and like should I have it? Should I not? And I'd say like, I think the research points to supporting the, protein intake before bed and not having it disrupt, sleep or any kind of type of metabolic markers. So I think that's a great option anytime, if you're hungry or find yourself hungry before bed or experimenting, as you mentioned, with eating before bed, go for a protein rich or at least something with some protein, right? Because if we have a mixed meal, which might has a little like protein, a little bit of fat, some carbohydrates, that's not going to have the same type of spike in your blood sugar compared to just eating a carb rich meal. Um,
So what protein would you eat before bed?
like probably, I mean, so obviously you don't want to be waking up from having to pee during the middle of the night a bunch. So it's like protein shakes can kind of be hit or miss, but I think like mixing protein, like a little bit of protein powder in with Greek yogurt, or just, maybe it's just Greek yogurt without the protein powder. But I think sometimes kind of nice to do like a little chocolate protein powder in Greek yogurt, and it's kind of like a little dessert. You kind of feel like you're eating chocolate pudding. But that might be great because like not a lot of liquids.
Yeah.
But also, you're getting some carbohydrates through the sugar in the natural sugars in dairy, but very limited. And you could always add some, you could add some high fiber like fruit in there, some berries, maybe some nuts a little bit for, depending on how calorie dense you are trying to make this, depending on where your energy needs are for the day and how hungry you are. But really thinking about, you know, the types of foods that you're consuming, their digestibility, right? Like having a steak right before bed versus Greek yogurt or protein shake,
Yeah.
very different as far as their digestibility and the time it's going to take to
So,
process.
and again, tell me if this is a myth, but I often do recommend a casein-based protein like yogurt or cottage cheese before bed because it's a slower release protein.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been shown to be a great option because as you mentioned, it will kind of sustain you with some amino acids longer into the night without, disrupting your sleep cycle. So,
Mhm. Yeah. Um, So you kind of talk like we've kind of talked a little bit about carb cycling. So do you adjust your intake throughout the day based on whether you have a higher intensity workout or, it's a low heart rate lift session or so do your days of eating, are they determined by your training that day or do you kind of eat the same thing all the time?
I think when it comes to recommendations for like general population, because like I think sometimes when I think about what I do, it's like, well, I'm also, you know, every day I'm thinking about nutrition because it's my job. So I also like
Yeah.
so I'm just trying to think of like what I start people at. And I would say like consistency is probably the most important thing for individuals. So before we and I think too, like sometimes people need more structure than less, and they feel like a little bit lost when they're adjusting all the time. And so I would say, like, first and foremost, like it can be a great starting point to just find a consistent, like find consistent meals and snacks across the day that maybe you make some swaps to increase variety here and there, like subbing one piece of fruit for a different type of fruit or vegetable or carbs or whatnot. But trying to keep things very consistent day to day can be um such an advantage to individuals who are just trying to build a routine and support their training and their goals. I think if you get a little bit more maybe advance from that, or maybe you're not counting macros and you're just going off of visual, look, building out your plates for each day. I definitely think that, we want to think about it's not pulling back when we're not doing as much, because I think that kind of mentality gets us kind of flirting with the whole having to earn your food. And that's
Mhm.
certainly not the picture we're trying to paint here. What we're trying to consider is like, okay, I have a bigger workout, I have a longer workout, I have a more intense workout coming up. I'm going to need some more carbohydrates to fuel that session. And so being able to enhance that meal to support that. And then on days where, it's maybe just a general workout day, or kind of a you're generally active or fairly active, but nothing crazy, then you can kind of fall back to like your middle ground plate where, we're looking at half our plate in fruits and vegetables, some starches or grains, ideally whole grains, and then, a quarter of the plate with protein. And we can kind of scale up depending if we have a bigger workout, and we can drop back to that as our baseline um, in periods where it's
Mhm.
pretty normal.
Yeah, that's kind of how I do it. Like I kind of eat the same thing most days, and then big workout days, I'll add a banana to my breakfast, and I'll add like a
Mm.
little bit more carbs throughout the day if I have bigger training sessions. But the base of what I eat is pretty much always the same.
Yeah,
Um,
you can always add in more snacks too. Like, snacks can be a great way to kind of, even if your meals all looked the same, and then your snacks were kind of like, hey, pre-workout, I'm going to add in a little pre-workout extra carb rich snack for this, or I'm going to throw in an extra, post-workout snack, with a little extra carbs or protein. Like that can be a great way to kind of make adjustments. Snacks can be a great way to make adjustments throughout your day, because snacks can be high protein and high fiber, or they can be, a bit of mix of carbs and protein, or just carbohydrates. So that can really skew some of the total intake, and, macronutrients, and or just to support more activity or less activity across the day.
so since we're kind of talking about adding carbs, I did have the question about carb loading.
Mhm.
And I think the science around this has changed even since I was in school and studying sport nutrition, and where the concept of carb loading then, as I learned it, was you actually would eliminate carbs for 7 days, and then the 3 days before you would hyperload with carbs, and then your system then would store more for the activity. Now, this never worked from a practical standpoint in my own situations, because
Mhm.
for me to reduce carbs in like prime time before a big event, I can't perform. So I'm like, well, whatever, I can't do this carb loading thing. And I would just increase a little bit of carbs, in the 3 days before. And that was kind of all I could really wrap my head around. So I never really got into like the nitty gritty of like true carb loading as people would do it now for long events. And again, this would really only be applicable when we're talking events that are into the couple hours.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because that, when I was in grad school studying sports nutrition as well, like that was an option. Like they kind of presented a couple different strategies of like how to carb load, or strategies that were put into practice. And that one didn't seem as like, it was definitely in there, but it seemed a bit more like a lot more complexities to it. As you mentioned, like most people before they go into a deload or taper week, it's going to be a pretty intense,
Mhm.
training, training block. And so you want to make sure you can support that properly. And also just knowing how immune systems tend to be compromised going into race weeks, injuries, usually you're at the peak of your, or you've been through a pretty intensive training block up to that point. And so to strip a lot of carbohydrates during that time frame, especially when volume is still high, just is, I think, a recipe for injuries and illness. So I definitely don't take that approach, but you do have to consider, as you said, like that was oftentimes for multiple hour duration events. And so I think it's important to consider, first of all, what are you training for, right? Like, or what's the event? Is it a Deca Strong or Mile? Is it a Deca Fit? Is it a High Rocks? Is it a triathlon? Is it an obstacle course race? So it's like there's a lot of different, there's a lot of different time domains involved in all of these different disciplines. And so usually that 90-minute mark is that sweet spot of like, okay, things less than 90 minutes, probably don't need to really do much of a formal carb load. If it's above 90 minutes and the longer it gets above 90 minutes, then we might want to bring that carb load, start that several days earlier. If it's shorter, we can probably get away with 24 to 48 hours beforehand. But a lot of individuals, I think it's important, like, what we're the objective of what we're trying to achieve with carb loading is to maximize glycogen on board in our muscles. And so in doing that, that can be achieved obviously through eating more carbohydrates, but also a reduction in training. And so that's why like the taper plus the emphasis on carbohydrates is such a great combination, such an important one, because those are going to play hand in hand with one another, right? If you increase your carbohydrate intake, but your training stays the same in the days leading up to an event, your, your net carbohydrate load or like, storage capacity in your muscles is going to be limited compared to if you were increasing carbohydrate intake and decreasing training. So ideally, we want to see both a taper in training, a reduction in training, and perhaps if it's a shorter race, maybe we just keep intake needs the same. Sometimes what I like to do, again, if it's, let's say it's a Deca Fit or even a High Rocks with an individual who's, sub 130, what I might oftentimes do is, we might start that carb load. It's less aggressive, but we might start that on, if the race is Saturday, maybe we start that on Wednesday. And it's just instead of doing a very like a pretty intensive approach with increasing carbohydrates, it's just like, hey, we're going to bump up carbohydrates a little bit more on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. And some people really like that compared to having an exorbitant amount of carbohydrates to hit all on like one day beforehand, or 2 days
Yeah.
before. But
Yeah. So, and from a numbers standpoint, like how much more in grams per day of carbs would you say someone might need?
so the textbook recommendations for like a true carb load, again, 90 minutes of an event or higher, we're looking at anywhere from 6 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram body weight, which is a lot. Like, I mean, if
Ooh.
you, yeah, so I definitely, you have to take into account an individual's total calorie needs first, because you do the math on that. And again, this is where it's important, like, if you're doing a 90-minute event compared to a 5-hour event, yeah, you would expect that like those targets are going to be quite different. That so that there is a large range, and obviously, like, you have to take into account someone who's doing this more as like a hobby, and performance is like they want to improve, but they're not not trying to be like swimming in carbohydrates, versus someone who's got really high training volume. A lot is at stake for this competition and what they're used to, right? So oftentimes I definitely look at what is our typical day-to-day carbohydrate intake, and even bumping up, 50 grams from that can be a large amount and feel like a lot for an individual. So I don't necessarily tend to go up more than 100 grams, and that just of carbohydrates. But again, this is so individualized. Like what I was saying was, if it's a shorter event, um, and they're keeping, like, they don't really need a carb load, but they're tapering their training, I might just recommend that they meet their normal everyday intake. So they're not pulling back just because training is lighter. They're just keeping at it. And what I might do is adjust the percentage of their total calories coming from carbohydrates. So maybe if they're used to, you know, 45% of total calories coming from carbs, I might bump that up and pull back fat a little bit, right? The day or two before a competition, it's okay to be in lower, to have a lower fat intake for a short period of time without that taking away or detracting from, performance
Mhm.
outcomes. We want to keep protein, fairly normal. Protein can take a little bit of a hit because an increase in carbohydrates does have a protein sparing effect. So, if you're tapering your training, but you're keeping your calories the same, extra emphasis on carbohydrates. Protein can be a little bit lower than what you typically might hit for a day or two, and then you can bump that back up post race.
Mhm.
Um,
If someone's never really thought about carb loading and you're going to experiment with this, don't
mhm.
do it for a race that's important to you. I would still recommend trying it. Like if let's say you have a big training session on a Saturday or a race sim, then kind of experience it because I do find also carb loading can lead to some GI distress also.
Yeah.
And then maybe your bathroom timing is different or something. So I wouldn't carb load with anything different than you normally eat. So even just a little bit more of what you already eat that you know you can handle in your stomach because there can be some GI distress with carb loading.
Yeah, and I think a good point that you brought up here that we should talk about, like if you're just like not sure where to start, a great starting place is to just keep what I always recommend to my athletes, especially if they're not tracking their food. I'm like, hey, you've got a lot to worry about for going into this competition. Don't put your energy into like recording your food intake necessarily unless that's helpful for you. Like, don't feel like you just need to do that for me. But what you can focus on is just increasing or not increasing, but sticking to a consistent meal and snack schedule throughout the day, which we all know, like when you're tapering and you don't have your
Mhm.
normal training sessions, it can be hard to stick to a schedule. So it's like, okay, keep breakfast, have that mid-morning snack, have lunch, have that afternoon snack, have dinner, and just make a little bit of a greater emphasis of carbohydrates at each of those meals and snacks. So it's like increase the portion a little bit, or you mentioned GI distress. We don't want fiber to be through the roof on, especially the day before a competition. We definitely want to make sure that the carbohydrates, even though we're thinking like, oh, high fiber is excellent to have most of the time and just like general non-competition days, but in the lead up to it, fiber can be unpredictable on race day. And so
Mhm.
what we want to do is, probably minimize like raw veggies, right? Maybe some cooked veggies throughout certain meals, but like that's not an emphasis. So you don't want to eat a salad, like order a salad the night before a race. Like that's not what we're looking to achieve. Probably wouldn't eat beans the day before the day before a race. So raw veggies, beans, really high fiber fruits like berries, for example. They're great. They're a great staple to have for everyday intake, but I can think of a lot of other fruits like, bananas, oranges, mangoes that are going to provide us with more carbohydrates and less fiber, and which is what we're looking for before a race. We want more carbohydrates, we want to minimize fiber. So just trying to switch some of the focus from high fiber foods and whole grains to maybe some simplified options the
Yeah.
day before.
Yeah. Worry about your veggies after the race.
Yeah, get all the veggies in, get all the protein in after all the colors.
hmm Um, yeah, so kind of shifting from that too is a topic that I find comes up so much also in the gym. And again, a lot of clients in my gym, we do focus on performance, but there's still we have um and again, maybe it's with hormone shifts, but a lot of them where they deal with bloating and some GI distress too. And the first thing that they want to do is to do water fasts because
Mm,
in their mind, so they want to clear the system.
yeah.
And I find fasting to be one of the most contradicting topics when you look at the research. And again, there's age considerations, and there's, is it a true water fast or what can you consume on a fast? And so, men, do men handle it easier and all these different ideas around it. How long should it be? And then, and then learning about autophagy and then at different levels of the fast where these different processes happen. And it's not something, and again, from an athlete standpoint, I could not fast because I don't think I could train, but I
Mm,
do have clients who will rely on it every so often when they're dealing with bloating. So, I mean, the
yeah.
bloating thing is its whole thing, and then the
Right.
fasting thing is also its own thing.
Yeah.
So I guess we can circle back to the bloating thing, but fasting is it appropriate for people? When is it appropriate for people? How long should they do it if they're going to do it? And what should they actually be taking in when they're fasting?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know you were like, let's address the bloating part later after, but I will say, like, understanding what the intent of the fast is can help us come up with a solution that doesn't impact performance in the same way that, that these extended fasts, you know, achieve perhaps. Because, I think that, when it comes to bloating, and I have a lot of clients, like a lot more lately,
Hmm.
who experience a lot of GI distress and bloating. And it's like doing those longer fasts, while it might be a temporary relief from that, you're not addressing the root cause of that bloat. And so it's like it's just going to keep coming up over and over and over again. And in the process, because you're restricting, you're eliminating all food for long periods of time, your performance is taking a huge hit. Your progress in the gym, like, we know how weak we can feel without, going even like 5 hours without food. And so I think understanding what the rationale behind it is first, makes allows us to come up with solutions, because it's either, like you said, the bloat or like digestive challenges, or it's more of just an approach for calorie restriction, right? I mean, yes, there's a lot of research about fasting and the autophagy, as you mentioned, reducing inflammation, improving blood sugar and insulin response. So it's like, yes, there are benefits with that, but when you combine that with performance, all of those benefits you see with performance, or sorry, with exercise. And
Yeah.
so, and Dr. Stacy Sims talks a lot about this, where she's like, where she'll talk about, like, yes, there are benefits to fasting, like we have that data, we have that information, but when you put that with, oftentimes when you see that in real life applied with exercise, they end up counteracting or contradicting one another. Because the reality is, what a lot of people end up doing with these fasts, and I'm just thinking more like time restricted eating, where, let's maybe move away, or maybe not in the context of 24 to 72-hour fast, but more so just like daily fasting of time
Like
restricted eating windows.
intermittent style
Yeah,
fasting.
intermittent
Yeah.
fasting, time restricted eating windows. It's like a lot of people are what they end up doing is starting that early in the morning. So like they're pushing off food intake until, maybe close to noon, but maybe they're still doing their morning workouts, and then they're eating, until about 8 p.m. Whereas like a lot of the research around, your circadian rhythms and timing food with with our day and light cycles, like that's where we see a lot of those extra benefits. And so I think a lot of people are kind of doing it a little bit backwards, if you will, or I guess, like you said, to kind of make them both, to be able to approach both and implement both simultaneously. What you would really want to do, especially if you train first, train in the morning, is to start your eating window or feeding window in the morning, and then just cut off like that later in the evening, kind of like, maybe it's from 10 to 6 or 8 to 4. But most people, it ends up being like 12 to 8, and that's not really, like, you're not getting a ton of the benefit out of
I
that.
think it's easier to delay the first meal than it is to cut off,
Oh, for sure.
you
But
know.
again, like that's not like most people. So you come off of an overnight fast, and this is the same principle for, for why you want to eat before training in the morning. But it's like when you're coming off of like overnight, you are in a catabolic state, right? Your body has not gotten food for a long period of time. And so your body, there's a lot of breakdown occurring. Then when you wake up in the morning and you are physically active, now you are increasing that catabolic state. Now you're, that, if we're talking about peaks and valleys, like we were in the valley when we woke up, and now we've dug ourselves several more feet under, because, we're doubling up on that catabolism. And that's where, you mentioned cortisol when we were talking earlier offline, and how our cortisol plays a role in especially middle-aged, perimenopausal, postmenopausal women. That is very much tied to underfueling and low energy availability when we're already in a catabolic state. We wake up, our cortisol levels are higher naturally in the morning, but then instead of giving ourselves fuel, we do physical activity, which increases our cortisol level. So now we've got like this exponential increase in cortisol production and no fuel to get us out of that or to help relieve us of that. And so probably the best thing we can do in the morning is, you know we come off of that overnight fast. We have a protein rich breakfast with some carbohydrates, especially, I think in general, but especially if we're going into a workout. And then, we can experience all the benefits that we're getting from exercise, but we're not just digging ourselves deeper into that hole in the morning.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for mentioning cortisol. I forgot about that one. That was another big question too that people always ask me about cortisol and its relationship to weight loss.
Mhm.
And the idea around high cortisol levels can stunt their weight loss goals. So then you would say elevated cortisols could also be an underfueling problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Cortisol is released when we're in a sympathetic state. So, a fight or flight kind of mode. And so we obviously are experiencing that. Like, we're going to experience that when we're physically active in the mornings, as well. And so it's like, and of course with stress. And so what we don't want to compound those things one after another without addressing the cortisol or relieving some of that cortisol response. And so how do we do that appropriately is through adequate fueling, not being underfueled, because that's going to now create an even greater stress response and just kind of feed that whole cycle over and over again. So I think, it's just important to recognize that. I mean, you take into account like increased cortisol and then already how prone women are to, especially middle-aged women who are experiencing more of the impacts because of low estrogen, which estrogen is a buffer for cortisol. And so when our estrogen levels are decreased, now we're impacted by cortisol much more significantly in this stage of life. And so it's important to know we're already, once you're entering into like your 40s and onwards, you're already at a risk for losing lean muscle mass. Not at a risk, it's much harder to maintain and certainly build lean muscle mass. And so under fueling or fasting is not going to be the answer to
Yeah.
helping set yourself up to build more lean
Mhm.
muscle mass. You
So then
need
it's interesting. So it might not even the weight loss might even be more related to as estrogen and cortisol relate to each other. It might even be more of the drop in estrogen, which for women it is their anabolic hormone. So is it the cortisol or is it the estrogen? And then
or is it the fasting? And it's all three, all three
right, yeah. And
right?
then if you're not eating your carbs before bed and then you're fasting from 6 p.m. on, you're creating this like monstrosity of problems that are all ending up in like the result. And then people kind of fixate on the one thing, it's my elevated cortisol, and then looking at, when you look at the big picture like that with all of it, and everyone's just trying to figure it all out sometimes, and with the fasting and the cortisol and the hormones and this and that sometimes, and then some without the proper information, they can be doing themselves such a disservice. So I'm glad you brought that one up because again, cortisol is such a big topic too, again, in gym world right now. So,
Well, one more thing I'll add, Bethany, is like fasting, it's even if we're talking in the sense of time restricted feeding or time or like some sort of intermittent fasting, it's like it's very unlikely that you're going to hit your daily protein targets in a very short feeding window. And so I think that's important. Obviously, if you're doing a 24, 48, 72-hour fast, you're not going to be getting protein in. And so again, for our aging population, but especially, our middle and older aged women, we can't afford to we can't afford to for our lean muscle mass to take a hit. And of course, like our lean muscle mass is our most metabolically active tissue. And so if you're losing, we're already losing that tissue during that phase of life, like it's already happening at a more accelerated rate. And so if we're not eating, if we're not getting enough protein in, then we're going to exacerbate that and compound that much, to a much greater degree. So, thinking about, even when you're thinking about like a time restricted eating window, it's trying to really make sure that, if you are dead set on that, it's like, well, you better still try, like, meet your energy goals for the day and also your protein goals. And that's going to be a really big challenge to do in 8 to 10 hours.
Hmm. Yeah, and I this one I know the fasting thing too is because I know some people just swear by it. So there's going to be people that disagree also with it because they love their 24 to 72-hour fast.
Yeah.
And I think the one book that people that really are proponent of fasting, it was called It's Fast Like a Girl. And so they're again their whole train of thought too, but I also think we do miss on again, as we get older, it's not as simple as I find like when you're in your 20s, we adapt so much more and it's easier to maintain muscle and but I think we do have to remember that age is such a big part of this too and just how difficult it is to maintain that muscle tissue with being later in life.
Yeah.
Um
And Dr. Stacy Sims is she's such an advocate for our peri and menopausal and postmenopausal aged women, and that, sensible nutrition strategies and exercise uh,
mhm,
focuses during that phase of life. And it's like she's devoted all of her research pretty much in those areas. And so Fast Like a Girl, that came out a while, like that's a little bit antiquated too. And or, like you said, maybe that's more targeted to a population that is in their, 30s or under. Whereas, the more recent research is showing, clearly shows that that's not a great approach for this population.
mhm.
So I definitely encourage listeners to check out more of her information, especially on fasting and what her thoughts are on that. So yeah, great.
Yeah. I direct all my female clients to Stacey Sims books too. I love it. But yeah, it's interesting too when we talk about nutrition because the science is still so new and there's still so much that we're learning. And even I was in university 20 years ago. So stuff that I learned then is has been debunked or changed since. And even and this is where I want to go next with it, but the microbiome project, which started after I graduated. So there was no discussion about the gut microbiome. That was all, well, I mean, it's not all discovered. There was research still leading up to it, but when they really dove into it, it was after 2007, after I graduated. So we didn't talk about the gut microbiome, and there was no discussion then, even which I find so fascinating. And I became a little bit obsessed with this too when I struggled with postpartum depression. But the connection of the gut to the brain and the everything that's developed in the gut itself with our neurotransmitters and how that can have such an effect on mental health. And that again, that's new science. This is stuff that we're just still kind of learning now. And again, because it's new, we're still probably just scratching the surface of it too. So I find that stuff so fascinating. Again, I have such a keen interest in mental health. And then when, learning all about that when I had my own struggles, and then just how important it is to maintain gut health because of the role that the gut microbiome plays on, the functioning of the brain itself. So, yeah, so maybe even just talk a little bit about that then. And when we talk about the gut microbiome, like what can people be doing to help that? And what might be maybe symptoms if you're struggling with this, it could be something that you need to consider a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up because it kind of like, going off of what we were talking about originally with the fasting, with the fasting topic is like a lot of people are experiencing more than ever now, like, um, bloat and digestive issues, and a lot of that's coming down to the state of the gut microbiome and, lacking diversity and quantity when it comes to good gut microbes. Which, we all have, if you want to, in layman's terms, like good, we all have good gut bacteria and bad gut bacteria. And ideally, we're gonna all have a little bit of both, but ideally the amount of good gut microbes are gonna far outweigh the presence and the diversity of the bad ones. It's like this symbiotic state of just of making sure that we've got enough good guys to beat the bad guys, essentially. And so how does that, like, where does that, how do we think about that as far as like actionable items that we can do and focus on nutritionally? Is like, fiber is such a big one, like probiotics and prebiotics, but a lot of people are, will just take probiotics and think that they're, doing their due diligence to address this issue. And it's like, well, you add good gut microbes um, into your diet, and you take those, and there's a lot of different types and qualities out there. So if they even make it alive into your gut microbiome is one facet that is something to consider as well. But it's like you just have to keep putting them in there if it's a unhealthy environment. They're just going to get killed off, and you've only got enough as long as you take them. But how do we create a healthy gut? A healthy gut environment is going to be through our prebiotic intake, which is our fiber, to that is basically the fuel for those good gut microorganisms. And so thinking about, like, if we increase, and Dr. Will Bolsowitz is actually he's like kind of the leading gut health expert, and doctor, and has some great resources out there. His book Fiber Fueled, he's got like a fiber fueled cookbook as well. But he definitely draws a lot of attention to the importance of fiber in the diet and diversity as well, because like we don't, I think a lot of times we want to look for the most convenient way to get fiber into the diet. And so we know now, just like with the protein craze, there's a lot of products that have a bunch of added fiber in it, and can tell it's high in fiber. But I think about like those carb balance tortillas that have like 13 grams of fiber in it. It's like none of that is naturally occurring, it's just added in. And so we know that every different plant food contains a different host of microorganisms. And so that's why diversity in our food intake is so important. And so, like, if you're eating the same couple of foods over and over again, well, that's going to be reflected in your gut microbiome, and that's going to be like that representation of those microorganisms. Whereas, like, if you can diversify your food, get lots of different plants, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, like those are going to increase the diversity. And of course, just keeping fiber consistent and higher is going to help feed all that good gut bacteria so they can replicate. I think a lot of people, because they're dealing with a lot of stomach issues these days and digestive issues, is they think, oh, I got to reduce my fiber intake. I just had a call earlier today. The gal was like, my stomach's been super unhappy, like so much bloat and pain. So she's like, I think I just like need to decrease my fiber intake. And that's like more times than not, that's actually like the opposite of what needs to be done. But you understand it because you hear like, okay, well, fiber kind of tends to make you a little bit like gassy, and but fiber adds a lot of bulk to our stools. It helps us become more regular and have more consistent bowel movements. And you think about when we hear a lot of bloat and digestive discomfort, oftentimes that can be from the opposite, like from constipation and not being able to have those bowel movements. So we need fiber in the diet, and we need less, oftentimes those products with added fiber. I was looking at this gal's diet earlier today, and I was just, she had a pretty good intake. Her fiber intake's around 35 grams or so each day. But I saw these protein pretzels in her, like I kept seeing that every single day. And she's been dealing with some really intense stomach pain. And so I pulled up those pretzels online, and they're of course like high protein. Anything with like a high protein that's like a manufactured good, like, probably a processed or ultra processed food. I just like to look into it more because oftentimes there's, same with protein bars, oftentimes there's a lot of added fiber to it as well. Like, so I was like, let me see. Because what we know is that a lot of times just products with added fiber in it or sugar alcohols tend to cause our gut a lot of pain and discomfort. So
Sugar
certain,
alcohols kill me.
yeah,
Kill my
yeah,
stomach.
a lot of people, but also same with sometimes like same with, I mean, it's just so hard. You look at some of these foods that are newly created and you're just like, I don't even know what I'm looking at. But she of course it didn't trigger, she had no idea that like the second ingredient um was fiber coming from corn and in a fairly large amount, and she doesn't tolerate corn very well, and that causes some disruption in her gut. So instead of like, she would have just kept on doing what she was doing but then minimized her fruit and vegetable intake, when really the culprit was some of these processes.
Hmm.
So all that to be said is like, really be mindful of like where your fiber's coming from, like making sure you're getting enough. And, you might feel a little gassy after eating like something like a cruciferous vegetables like broccoli or like onions or garlics for certain individuals. But what we know is like if we can keep the exposure fairly consistent, it doesn't have to be large quantities, but the reason why your gut is creating those like butane gases that cause us to be gassy is because they lack the gut bacteria to process those carbohydrates because you don't eat it that much. So instead of just having like beans every once in a while and feeling like, oh, my stomach is in knots, if you can kind of keep a small presence of beans on a more regular basis, you're going to build up the gut bacteria to support those foods and oftentimes be able to increase your variety of fibrous foods.
So, what kills the good bacteria? What's the worst things that we can do?
What kills the good bacteria a lot of times are, I mean, so one is just eliminating their food source, right? So really get like eating a low fiber diet is going to probably be the biggest thing. You're just going to starve your good gut bacteria. I'd say probably the worst thing, but it's probably necessary if you're taking these, is antibiotics. Antibiotics is just going to wipe out
Hmm.
the good and the bad, which is why, ideally you don't take them unless you really need to. But I know some people who are just like, they're constantly taking antibiotics for this and that and this and that. It's like, oh, my doctor recommended this. So yeah, I'll just do this for 7 days. And it's like, and you don't realize like it can take several weeks to build back up. And and you're compromised, your immune systems and everything else that's related to, your gut health, which now we know is like you said, mood, you know, depression and other like mood disorders and inflammation throughout the body, to name a few. Like so many things are impacted by the state of our gut. And so if we're very frequently like, if we're very quick to take antibiotics just to wipe out something nasty, but we don't realize like the detriments that it can have on, our health for several weeks, if not months, following that, we need to really consider the impacts, the implications that has. So I'd say, yeah, like certain, and that goes for a lot of different medications too. Like I couldn't tell you like off the top of my head, but I just know like a lot of medications, like, that is going through our gut. And so to recognize that there's probably a lot of a lot.
Even like NSAIDs, like people that
Oh
take
yeah.
chronic amounts of Advil, from just, muscle soreness and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say there's like medication use, lack of fiber in the diet, which is very, it's more common than not. Like, daily recommendations for women are, 25 grams or more. Men, it's 35, minimum of like 35 grams. And it's crazy that how many people aren't even coming close to that. And certainly not coming close to that on a consistent basis. So really important. Like that's such a great starting point. If I had like two things that I would recommend people look at when it comes to their diet, it would be like focus on getting enough protein, adequate protein, and getting sufficient fiber throughout the day.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that's so great for the general population too. And I think we discuss a lot of the nitty-gritties of things, but you do always come back to just like consistency and whole foods. And we'll kind of wrap it up here with just some thoughts for, again, not everyone is a high performance athlete and, fine-tuning and tracking and really needing to worry about the nitty-gritty um for their lifestyle and just their goals. So for the masses, then how do you really approach it? And I I always tell people to like worrying so much about all these supplements and stuff when you're not even like you said, if you're not eating main hitting your protein and fiber goals, like the supplements is again so high up on that hierarchy of needs, like when we look at things from a nutrition standpoint. So, kind of talk to the masses here more. So,
Yeah. Yeah. If I had to think about like a couple things that, again, it could work, application for everyone, like you said, no matter if they're a super active individual or more sedentary or, have performance versus aesthetic goals or, um, tracking their food intake versus not. It's like there's definitely some key items that we can really fall back on and everyone can focus on getting better at the basics, right? But I would say one of the top things and probably one of the first things that I work on with new clients is establishing like a meal and snack schedule that fits like that they can kind of adhere to most days and just for consistency's sake, right? Like just getting the body used to fueling at certain times so that hunger is kept in check because more times than not, like where we end up making poor decisions around food is when our hunger's high, which and at that point we're just very reactive when it comes to our food choices. We're just thinking, like, okay, what's nearby? What is going to give me enough calories to satiate this incredible hunger? And and I'm oh yeah, I'm super busy, so it can't take very long, right? Okay, well, guess what's going to be the solution to that? Obviously, like grabbing fast food, very likely. So if we can eat at a point where our hunger is not, you know, between an 8 and 10, and we can eat more around like 6 or 7, that's probably going to allow us to be in a position to make more just to make smarter food choices and to think about, okay, what do I want, but also what do I know I need, and can I find a balance there? So consistency with meal schedule is great, and with snacks, it's like those are great opportunities to bridge gaps between meals. And so if you're someone who wakes up super early, like 5 a.m., and then your lunch isn't till noon, that's 7 hours. Like you're not gonna make it till lunch without eating anything, and especially if you're active in the morning. So thinking about snacks and having a consistent snack schedule to kind of meet you halfway between those meals. So that's excuse me, that would be one recommendation. I think the other one, as we talked about, is protein intake throughout the day. And you don't need to be calculating all your protein intake to work to focus on this. What I like to do, again, if you have a consistent meal and snack schedule, let's just say it's 3 meals and 2 snacks, then you kind of can do a little bit of the math to know, like, you can easily estimate your protein needs, usually anywhere between zero point 0.7 and 1 gram per pound, maybe a little bit higher for individuals who are going through menopause, or more susceptible to loss in lean muscle mass, or who are, dieting or trying to achieve body composition goals. Protein we can certainly bump that up a little bit from there. But 0.7 to 1 is a good general guideline. But it's like if you're roughly around 120 or 150 grams per day or 200 grams a day, it's like, and you have a consistent meal and snack schedule, you can set some targets for what you're trying to achieve at a meal. Oh, am I aiming for 20 grams a meal, 30, 40 grams, more than that? And so that can be an easy way just to kind of eyeball about like what your protein intake is. Like you can look at the back of a yogurt container and be like, okay, how much, what's a serving size, but also like how much protein is that going to get me? Oh, 3/4 of a cup is 20 grams. Cool. Okay, that's 20 grams. I'm trying to get to 30. So, am I going to add what am I going to add to that? Am I going to add a little bit of oatmeal and that actually might bump it up like 5 grams because there's protein in some oats? Do I mix in a little protein powder with that? Do I have a piece of toast with an egg with that? So it's like there's a lot of different ways we can kind of just loosely calculate protein
Hmm.
intake on a meal by meal basis. And that way we don't have to keep this running tally of tracking our food intake.
Hmm.
Um, so I would say meal and snack schedule, protein intake, fiber. Like I think that's just another one, like, because fiber is only found in carbohydrates. Fiber is a component of plant foods. All plants are carbohydrates. Some of them have carbohydrates and fats. If you're thinking about like avocado or nuts and seeds, but like they're all plants are always going to have carbohydrates. And so your less processed plants are going to contain oftentimes more fiber. And so if you're hitting 25 grams a day for females, at least 35 grams a day for men, it's a good gauge of the quality of carbohydrates because, if you're eating carbohydrates, but your fiber is not high at all, you might not be eating enough carbohydrates to support a healthy gut, because the fiber is low, or more of your carbohydrates from the day might be coming from processed and ultra processed foods that are low in fiber. So that can just be a great measure of quality carbohydrates, but also you can just focus on, whole foods, fruits and vegetables, and every once in a while glance at the fiber content of, on the nutrition label. Most of the food with most of the irony is that most of the foods that are high in fiber aren't going to have a nutrition label because they'll be like apples or oranges or bananas or but still, you could, from oats and beans and nuts and seeds, you can tend to see that from the package. So really, I think that those would be like my four things, like consistent meal and snack schedule, protein intake, and distributing that fairly evenly throughout your meals and snacks, like throughout the day. Few fiber intake, and I guess the last one, because we do tend to work with at least somewhat active individuals,
Hmm.
is just fueling around your workouts. Making sure that if you haven't eaten for a while and you're going to work out, don't overcomplicate it of like, what do I need? How much protein, how much carbohydrate do I need? Fat, isn't that? It's like just eat something, ideally first.
Yeah.
Like start with that, get some food in you because no one wants to be hungry during a workout. You're probably not going to perform very well if you are hungry. And afterwards, if you're not having a meal within, an hour or two, then and depending on how long or intense the workout is, like have a snack before before that next meal. So I think just kind of like bookending your workouts with nutrition, whether it's from a meal and snack, plus those other items, I think are a really, really solid foundation for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much. That does, I mean, for most people, that's where they need to start anyways. And a lot of people are not really meeting those benchmarks anyways. So when you kind of the questions that we get sometimes, it's people do worry about the tiny details and then, miss the big. So yeah, those are great points then to just kind of leave people with to focus on that and, do a good job of that first. So thanks. You speak so eloquently and so intelligently, and you're just such a good resource to have on. So we appreciate you coming back. And we had a lot of really fantastic feedback after the last one. So yeah, we did really want to follow up with a little bit more. So because we had a lot of other questions still. So I appreciate you taking the time to come back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. You ask such great questions, and I love that you have a lot of engagement from your audience and that they've been able to share what they want to learn more about. So happy to come on as many times as needed, and I just appreciate you having me back.
Yeah. And thanks so much everyone for listening. And yeah, until next time, just, get that protein and fiber in. So and keep getting those workouts in too. So till next time, thanks so much.